Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Sinai Temple's weekly Parsha class. We are in Parshat Va'era this week. I like to call these next few weeks Pesach in January. That's because we are very familiar with the text of these couple of Parshiot. Last week we began the book of Exodus, the second book of the Torah of Shemot. And once we get into exile, if you wish, into slavery in Egypt, then, of course, we are telling the story of Passover, which we are very familiar with in the month of April with the Haggadah. But the foundational text of the Passover story are found in the Parshat Va'era, in next week, Parshat Bo, because we have the 10 plagues. We're going to talk a little bit about numbers to begin with, the numbers 4 and the number 10. And then we're going to look at one verse that is often skipped over, but really deals with the emotional state of the people and what state they are in and what state they wish to get to. I want to begin, we're going to not deal with the 10 plagues right now, maybe next week, but I want to begin with the number 4. In the Haggadah, we have, of course, the 4 children, the Chacham, the wise, the Rasha, the wicked, the Tam, the simple, and the She'eno Yodea Lishol, the one who does not know how to ask questions. But another thing that is 4 is the 4 cups of wine. With the 4 cups of wine, you might ask why the number 4, and that comes from Parshat Va'era, the book of Exodus, chapter 6, verse 6 through 8, where 4 different words are used in order to describe God taking the Israelites out of Egypt. The first one is, I shall take you out. The second is, I shall rescue you. The third is, I shall redeem you. And also the last one is, I shall take you. We're going to look at that in the Hebrew for just a moment. It says, Lachen amor libnei Yisrael, Ani Adonai, I am God. The first one in Hebrew, vehotzeti. Right? We know that word from the song Dayenu, Ilu Hotzianu, that I am God and I will take you out of Egypt, mitachat sivlot Misraim, from under the burdens of what you were facing in Egypt. The second one in verse 6 is Hitzalti, and I will save you, etchem me'avodatam. I will save you from basically their labor, their work. The third one is Ga'alti, I will redeem you. We hear that word each and every Amidah. Before we say Baruch Atah Adonai Ga'al Yisrael, that God is the redeemer of the people Israel. And the last one is Lakachti, I will physically take you. Lakachti edchem li la'am, and I will take you because you are my nation. Hayiti lachem le'elohim, and I am your God. Vidatem ki ani Adonai, that you should know that I am your God. Ani Adonai Elohechem, hamotzi edchem mitachat sivlot Mitzrayim. I will draw you forth from those burdens of Egypt. And again, the next sentence again, veheveti, and I will bring you out. Where? El haaretz, to that land, asher nasati et yadi latetota, which I promised to give to your ancestors, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, morasha ani Adonai, that I will give you as a heritage because I am God. So the 4 cups of wine that we see in the Passover Seder comes specifically from chapter 6, verse 6 through 8. But the next line, chapter 6, verse 9, I want to focus on that for a moment. And that line says this in the Hebrew, Vayedaber Moshe, Hein el b'nei Yisrael. But when Moses told this to the Israelites, when Moses told the people that God will do this, that God will take them and save them and redeem them and draw them forth out of Egypt, these next few words, Velo shamu el Moshe. Shamu means to listen, to hear, the word shema. Velo shamu. They did not listen to Moses. Why? Mikotzer ruach. This word ruach we know is spirit or energy. Their spirits mikotzer ruach. Their spirits were crushed. Ume avodah kasha. Why? Because of the very hard work that they were facing. I want to look at 5 or 6 different commentaries of why the people in that state of slavery, even though Moses tells them directly from the words of God that God will take them and redeem them out of Egypt, into the promised land, they cannot hear that at that moment. They cannot hear that at that moment. You know, when I was studying the Parsha Va'era these last few days, I couldn't help but think of the hostage in Israel or in Gaza, the three that came home on Sunday, and the ones that are now waiting to come home, God willing, this coming Saturday and more in the weeks to come. If they were told in Gaza, Heveti, Hitzalti, Ga'alti, Lakachti, God will take them out, what would they think? Probably no. In fact, just a few moments ago, as a testimony of Romi Gonen and all of the hostages that were released, they said two things. One, they did not know that they were going to go home until Sunday morning, just hours before. And number two, they said, I thought I would die in Gaza. And go back thousands of years. Slavery in Egypt. These people grew up this way. They were born into slavery. They didn't even understand what it meant to be free. And here's Moses, who grows up basically in the court of Pharaoh and tells the people, hey, God's going to come and do all these miracles. What would they think? It's a natural reaction. Velo shamu el Moshe. Of course they're not going to listen to Moses. Mikotze ruach. Their spirit was crushed from my avodah kasha, from this hard work. So let's begin with the most famous commentator, Rashi, who simply says, Velo shamu el Moshe. Why did they not listen to Moses? They did not accept his words of comfort. So many times when people are at a loss, it's not often what we say, but rather it's what we don't say that gives people comfort. If we say, oh, I understand your pain, we don't understand somebody's pain in that moment. Moses was simply trying to comfort the people, but Rashi says, no, they could not accept Moses' words of comfort. Not only do we thinking of the hostages at this moment, but on a local level, where we are ground zero for the Los Angeles fires, so many people in pain and suffering have lost everything. If they say, hey, don't worry, God's going to bring you out, sometimes that's not a message that they want to hear. It's not a message that we want to hear. But also it's not a message that we are able to hear in this moment, even though maybe in years down the road, that is the message that we should hear. And so Rashi continues, Mikotze ruach. He expands on what it means to have a crushed spirit. And this is what Rashi says. He says, if one is in anguish, his breath comes in short gasps and he cannot draw long breaths. Right? Think about if you're nervous and you're breathing heavily. That is what it means to be in crushed spirit. In a somewhat similar manner, Rashi says, he cites the verse from Jeremiah, where Jeremiah says, this once will I cause them to know my hand and my might, and they shall know that my name is God. Rashi is saying that to understand God's name, it's not an easy thing, right? In this moment, there cannot be any comfort. And so Moses tells them these words, but it may not sink in until later. So that's Rashi. Again, we're simply focusing on these four words, Mikotze ruach umei avodah kasha, that the people had a crushed spirit or from the difficult work. Ibn Ezra, a few years later than Rashi, also in the Middle Ages, he focuses on the words Vayidaber Moshe, and that Moses spoke to the people. Ibn Ezra says, Israel did not hearken or pay attention to the words of Moses. Why? As their spirit was impatient because of the length of their exile and the hard labor which was recently put upon them. The people of Egypt were not in exile for 2 days or 50 days. They were in exile for years and generations. And so they couldn't understand that they even had the possibility to be free. Next, we move to Ramban, which is Nachmanides. See here, one second. And he says this. When he looks at Mikotze Ruach, the crushed spirit, he says this: it was not because they did not believe in God. The people did believe in God. Rather, they paid no attention to Moses' words because of their, he uses this word, impatience of spirit. The Torah says that their spirits were crushed, but Ramban Nachmanides says that they were impatient of spirit. As a person whose soul is grieved on account of his misery and who does not want to live another moment in his suffering, even though he knows that he will be relieved later. That is important, what Nachmanides says. Just as I said before, even though the people understand what they need to hear, they cannot hear it because they are impatient. In our lowest moments, we are impatient. We want something to happen now. Every single tragedy. Even over these last few years, and it's hard to imagine that I'm even listing these, but in the pandemic, we were impatient. We wanted things to change now. After October 7th, on October 8th, we wanted things to change now. During the hostages, we wanted things to change now. During these fires and the destruction, we want things to change now. But Nachmanides says, even during these times, our belief doesn't diminish, and we know that we're going to be relieved later. But in these moments of suffering, we have an impatience of spirit. He continues, the impatience of spirit was the fear. What was the impatience? That Pharaoh would put them to death, as their officers said to Moses. And the cruel bondage, when it says avodah kasha, hard work, what was that? It was the pressure, because the taskmasters pressed on them and hurried them, which gave them no chance to hear anything and consider it. So number one, they had impatience of spirit, that they knew they were going to have a better life later, but they could not hear it in the moment. But two, they were working so hard that they literally could not consider it, right? When I wrote my thesis on music and halakha and Jewish law, one of the most interesting texts I found about playing music on Shabbat was that slave laborers were allowed to sing and play instruments on Shabbat. Why? Because that was the way that got them through their day. If you talk to somebody who has been enslaved or has been imprisoned or has gone through just terrible trauma, they need something to get their mind off of the actual trauma in order to get to that point, to shamu el Moshe, to actually listen to the words of somebody else that are trying to comfort them. And so you can see that these commentators, Rashi, Ibn Ezra, Nachmanides in the 13th century, they are trying to explain what, number one, the definition of a crushed spirit is, but number two, how the people did not lose belief, but also didn't have the ability to hear while understanding the message that they needed to hear. We're going to look at three more and then do one modern commentary. The next one is Sforno, an Italian commentator, a little later. He says, when it says that they did not listen to Moses, this is what it meant. They did not listen to Moses to mentally absorb all of this, so that they would have full trust in the salvation of God and give God credit for this. Remember the sentence right before, Veheveti, Velakafti, Vehitzalti, Vegaalti, these four different ways that God was going to, boom, perform miracles. But they were not ready to mentally absorb all of this. Yes, they were going to give God credit, but they could not do it at that moment. Now, in this moment, Sforno compares the slaves in Egypt to Abraham. He says this is where they were different from Abraham in his time. In Abraham's time, he believed implicitly in an impossible sounding promise. Let's go back to Parshat Lech Lecha just a couple of months ago, right? Abraham, the first Jew, God comes to Abraham and says, Lech Lecha me'artzecha milotecha beit avicha, leave your house, leave your father's house, and I will go to a land that I will show you. Not many people would actually do that. But Abraham says, okay, he implicitly believed in an impossible sounding promise. Now think about this moment. Slaves in Egypt, Moses comes and tells them these four words that God's going to save them. But what do they say? Lo shamu el Moshe mikotzer ruach. I cannot believe in this impossible sounding promise. Who gave credit to God for making such a promise? Abraham gave credit. This was eventually the reason why this part of God's promise was not fulfilled in the lifetime of the people who were being addressed at this time. They could not believe in an impossible promise. Again, I keep going back to this hostage crisis and now this hostage deal. We thought, okay, maybe after a couple of days, the hostages would come home. But if you listen to the hostages that did come home, right, they got used to their surroundings, not in a good way, but that was to become their life until they were literally saved. And so there is a moment in time when somebody needs the capacity to mentally absorb what they are hearing. I heard also from these hostages reading the papers this last few days that when they watched TV, they understood what was happening and how hard their families and Israel was working to get them home. Only then did they realize that maybe this was not an impossible promise, that they would actually come home. Mikotze Ruach, Nachma or Sforno continues, crushed spirit. He says, for it did not appear believable to their present state of mind, so that their heart could not assimilate such a promise, right? In their state, their spirit was so crushed that they could not even believe that such a promise would ever be possible. And finally, Ume'avodah kasha, what does it mean for Sforno to say hard labor? If it had not been for the heavy labor which they had to perform, they would have paid much more attention to Moses' words. If they were just slaves, but were actually not working, then they would have time, but they were working so hard that they could not even have the time to comprehend. And they would have understood that Moses' arguments made what he said were very believable, right? They were working so hard they could not even believe that something like this would be believable. So you can see that these commentators are really trying to make sure that we see that there was a belief in God during slavery, but the factors that remove the belief that did not allow them to understand what was really happening. Okay, we're going to go to two more. The next one is called the Malbim. Let me just pull it up here. Give me one moment. And the other is called the Orachaim. Second. The Malbim. 19th century. A little later, right? We've just gone through commentaries from Rashi in the 10th century all the way through the 19th century. So 1,000 years of commentators are looking at these words of Mikotze Ruach and say, what did it mean that their spirits were crushed? And I would say, what does it mean that our spirits are crushed today? And how can we have these beliefs below Shamu al Moshe when Moses or the Torah comes down to us and says, God will save us? What does that mean? The Malbim in the 19th century says, but they did not listen to Moses on account of their weakened spirits. He says spirit designates an inner spirit, right? This is an inner feeling. This past weekend, we had the true fortune of hosting Faithful Central Bible Church at our Martin Luther King Shabbat. But on Sunday morning, 50 members of Sinai Temple went to Faithful Central Bible Church, and Pastor Dr. John Paul Foster, a good friend of mine in this community, gave a beautiful sermon using the exact text of the Old Testament, the Torah, in Hebrew Divrei Hayamim and English Chronicles, when Yehoshaphat is going to be attacked by an army, and he says basically sort of the same thing, that the people were crushed of spirit. And what do? And Dr. Foster explained the difference of when our physical body wants to do something different than what our spirit wants to do. That our emotions and our physical body are trying to clash. How do you more follow the spiritual speaks? And so Malbim says that when they said that their spirits were crushed, it was an inner spirit that was crushed. It was not just the physical labor that was physically hurting them, but there was an inner spirit. He says there is also an enduring spirit, which is someone who can hold down his feelings and tolerate grief, pain, and hurt. Right? When we are trying to uplift our inner spirit, we have to suppress that pain and grief that we feel. He said and its opposite is a diminished spirit. So on one side, you have an enduring spirit that's trying to lift up, and on the other side, you have a diminishing spirit that is trying to push us down. Malbim says, as he wrote in his commentary on Mishle, Proverbs, so somebody who has a weakened spirit but does not have hard work, or who has hard work but he has an enduring spirit, can rein in his grief and listen to words of consolation and to good news. So there's a balance of power here between spirit and hard work. Let me repeat that. If your spirit is weak, but you don't have hard work, right? You can have the ability to listen. Or if your spirit is, you have an enduring spirit, but you have a lot of hard work, you also can get through those moments. So he explains the moments of when God's belief can still be there. However, he says, these people in Egypt, they had hard work and they had depressed spirits. And that is why they were too weak to bear and tolerate their work. That is why the words of Moses did not make an impression on them. They, in order to continue that belief in something that good will happen, you either have to have high spirits and high work, or low spirits and low work. But if you have low spirit and low work, that is a recipe for not being able to hear these words of Moses. And so I want us to think about our own lives. If we are in a situation where we believe that we cannot go on any longer, how can we have our enduring spirit take over? Or if we're in a time when we're sort of lazy, how can we, or in a depressed spirit, then how can we enliven that to make sure we have an enduring spirit? The last Torah commentary I want to speak about before we go to a more modern commentary is called the Or HaChaim. The Or HaChaim is an 18th century commentator incorporating mysticism from Morocco. And he says this. He says, perhaps, give me 1 second here. Got to get the commentary. Sorry, using technology of Sefaria. He says this. Their impatience of spirit and cruel bondage, perhaps the people did not respond positively to this assurance, right? Moses says, hey, everything's going to be okay. They don't respond positively. Well, why? I love this. Because they have not received the Torah yet. Remember, we are chronologically in the Torah. We're not at Mount Sinai yet. We're not at Shavuot. We're not even in Pesach. We haven't been released from Egypt. So the Or HaChaim says, of course they're not going to respond positively. We don't have the Torah. So what does that mean? He says, since the Torah broadens a person's mind, the Torah may hint at that by describing the Israelite state of mind as narrow-minded and limited, right? We have not been enlightened by the Torah. We have not been inspired. Where do we go when things are tough in our life? We go to our foundational text of Torah and are inspired by the people that came before us. But in this moment, the Israelites, the Jewish people, have not even received the Torah yet. And since they haven't received the Torah yet, then of course they couldn't hear Moses. Of course their spirits were crushed. But one day when they do receive the Torah, then they will have the energy, as Malbim said, that enduring spirit to uplift themselves, to find inspiration in what will be ahead. That, I believe, is a beautiful teaching on the mysticism of the value of our Torah. It's not just stories, but the Torah itself is the enduring spirit that will lift us up from the avodah kasha. And finally, I want to quote an article by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs that he wrote in 5776, which is about 9 years ago, and it's called Spirits in a Material World. And he looks at this verse of Mikotze Ruach and of avodah kasha, of crushed spirit, and of hard labor, and he says this. He says, there's something going on well beneath the surface. He says, Moses was both right and wrong. Right that they did not listen to him, but wrong about why. V'lo shamu al Moshe, they didn't listen to Moses. Yes, Moses, you are correct. But why didn't they listen to him? Remember earlier in the Torah, God tells Moses, you're going to be the leader, and Moses said, I have a stutter. No, there's no way they're going to listen to me. He says, oh, don't worry, I'll be by your side. Take your brother Aaron. But why didn't they listen? Rabbi Jonathan Sachs of blessed memory says, they didn't listen because their spirit was broken and because the labor was harsh. In other words, this is Rabbi Sachs's interpretation. If you want to improve somebody's spiritual situation, you must improve their physical situation. He said that is one of the most humanizing aspects of Judaism. That's one of the most humanizing aspects of Judaism. You have to improve somebody's physical situation in order to improve their spiritual situation. He goes on that Maimonides emphasizes in the Guide of the Perplexed. He says the Torah has two aims. Number one, the well-being of the soul, and number two, the well-being of the body. He says, as we've been talking about this morning, the well-being of the soul is internal, it's spiritual, it's soul-related. But the well-being of the body requires a strong society and economy where there's rule of law, division of labor, promotion of trade. He says we have bodily well-being when all of our physical needs are supplied. But we cannot do this alone. We specialize in exchange. That is why we need a good, strong society. Spiritual achievement, says Maimonides, is a higher than material achievement. But we need to ensure the latter because a person suffering from great hunger, thirst, heat, or cold cannot grasp an idea, even if it is communicated by others, much less can he arrive by it at his own reasoning. Rabbi Sachs says, if we lack physical needs, there is no way we can reach spiritual heights. When people's spirits are broken by harsh labor, they cannot listen to Moses. If you want to improve somebody's spiritual situation, you must improve their physical conditions. And again, I bring to our attention what has happened in our own community these last few weeks here in Los Angeles. People's physical situations are at their lowest. People who have lost their homes and every single possession in their lives, they're at their lowest. Velo shamu el Moshe, they didn't listen to Moses. That is absolutely right. We are not in the situation to say that our spiritual needs are all ready. So what are we doing? As a community, as a world, the outpouring of support from colleagues around the country, from Israel, we have been helping people's physical situation, not sending prayers, but allowing our prayers to turn into action. We have witnessed welcoming those who have lost everything into our physical homes here at the synagogue. I have heard story after story of people welcoming people in their own homes, feeding them, giving them clothes, giving them warmth, giving them shelter. Only then, as Rabbi Sachs says, when we fix their physical situation, giving them physical well-being. In fact, in the Misha Berach prayer we say every week, we say, we should pray for physical and spiritual well-being. Often we say, oh, let's take care of the spiritual first. But no, Rabbi Sachs knows, Malbim knows, Or HaChaim knows, we have to take care of our own bodies and our own selves. Only when we do that can we get to the spiritual well-being that we need. It goes together. And so we pray this week that we, Lo shamu el Moshe mikotzer ruach me'avodah kasha. In the Torah, we learn that the people did not listen to Moses because of their crushed spirit. And so we pray this week that our crushed spirit should be enlivened, should be inspired, should be woken up. Because even during the most difficult tragedy that we have witnessed both here in our lives in Los Angeles and also in Israel, we know that we also have seen triumph. Triumph of the physical, triumph of the spirit, triumph of the heart, and the triumph of our people. We wish everybody a good week.